Welcome to Hatman Strikes Back Daily Boxing News. IBF heavyweight champion Daniel Dubois has been given permission to make a voluntary defense of his title. IBF president Daryl Peoples said Dubois can make an optional defense against any ranked fighter before April 22nd, 2025. Dubois' promoter Frank Warren has confirmed that Dubois will fight in February, so that fits within the time frame. The question is, which opponent will Daniel Dubois choose? Well, if we have a look at the current top 15 IBF heavyweight rankings here on their website, you can see all the potentials. Now, for me as a boxing fan, I would prefer Daniel Dubois to fight the highest ranked available contender, but at a bare minimum, in my view, he should not be fighting anybody who's coming off a loss. So let's go through all these guys from number 15 to number 3. As you can see at the top of the table, number 1 and 2 are not rated, and that's to do with some of the intricacies of the IBF's rating system. Functionally, AIC Cabael and Martin Bakole are actually number 1 and 2, and they, in fact, have been ordered to fight each other in a final eliminator to establish the next IBF mandatory challenger. Alright, so we'll start off with number 15, Justice Hooney. He's a 25-year-old fighter from Australia, orthodox, 6 foot 4 inches tall. His record is 10-0 with 5 KOs. His record suggests that he isn't much of a puncher, but what should be noted is that because of his quite extensive amateur background, he turned pro in 2020 with a 10-rounder. See, that's quite unusual. Normally when fighters turn pro, they're fighting in 4-rounders, 6-rounders, and so on. They build their way up to 10 and then eventually 12. Whereas Justice Hooney started out with a 10-rounder. It's only very, very experienced amateurs who tend to do that when they turn pro. Guys who have had often over 100 fights. And the reason I make that point is because Hooney didn't turn pro fighting the weakest journeyman out there. Not that his opposition has been great, it hasn't, but I want to say it's been a bit better than the average prospect, and that may to some extent account for the lack of KOs, although from watching Justice Hooney several times as I have, he doesn't appear to be a devastating puncher. All but 2 of his fights so far have been in his native Australia. The ones that weren't were against the 2 most notable names on his record. Former cruiserweight contender Andrew Tabiti, who he fought in Mexico, winning a unanimous decision over 10 rounds, and current WBC Bridgerweight world champion Kevin Lorena, who he fought on the Joshua Ngannou undercard in Saudi Arabia. He also beat him on a UD over 10 rounds. Hooney is promoted by Matchroom, and he appears to still be very much in the building phase of his career, the prospect phase. But given how keen Eddie Hearn seems to be to make a fast buck off some of these fighters, I couldn't completely rule out the possibility of him sacrificing Justice Hooney at this stage of his career to Daniel Dubois. Not saying it's going to happen, I'm just saying I wouldn't rule it out. And personally, I wouldn't want to see this fight right now. It might be one for the future if Hooney can continue to build and improve. Number 14 on the list is Gino Vianello. He's from Italy, 30 years of age, orthodox fighter, 6 feet 6 inches tall. He's got a record of 13-2-1, 11 wins by knockout. He's based in the United States, where all but 2 of his professional fights so far have been. The first blemish on his record occurred back in 2020 when he had a majority draw over 6 rounds against Kingsley Ibe. Some of you may remember that Kingsley Ibe got brutally beaten up and knocked out by Jared Anderson much earlier on in his career. So Vianello had a draw with him. The next blemish was a 7th round TKO loss on cuts to Jonathan Rice. That was back in January 2023. The third blemish was a 10-round split decision loss to Faajijagar earlier on this year. Now that fight was very close, and many people were of the view that Vianello maybe deserved the nod. Vianello is a big guy, he can move a little bit, has some power there, but not a devastating puncher, and he appears to be quite tough. In my estimation, he's going to be very high up the list of Dubois' potential opponents. Maybe even number 1. Now, I'm not saying that I want him to be the guy that Dubois picks. I'm saying that I think Dubois will be very keen on this fight, and his handlers will be very keen on this fight. Vianello's only notable win, really, was his last contest against Arslan Bekmambetov, who he stopped in 8 rounds. Bust up his face. Vianello has been a sparring partner for Daniel Dubois quite recently, so Dubois will be very familiar with him. And I think that's one of the reasons, aside from the fact Vianello is quite beatable, that I think Dubois and Frank Warren will be keen on fighting this guy. Moving up to number 13 on the list, we've got Jared Anderson. Now, as I said earlier on, I do not want to see Daniel Dubois fight anybody coming off a loss. He's a champion at the end of the day. If Daniel Dubois was just a contender and he didn't have a belt, I maybe wouldn't mind so much if he was fighting somebody coming off a loss. But as a champion, no, you have to be held to a higher standard. It's not like Dubois just fought Jared Anderson and there was a rematch clause in the contract. No, this will be a voluntary defense. And I do not agree whatsoever with champions fighting opponents coming off a loss when it isn't a contracted rematch or anything like that for a voluntary defense. I don't agree with it at all. If Anderson can get some wins under his belt again and continue to improve, then maybe somewhere down the line, he and Dubois can fight each other because they're similar in age. I mean, Anderson's actually 3 years younger than Dubois. But for now, for me, no. I don't want to see this fight. Would Dubois want it? Probably. Would Anderson take it? If it's on a Riyadh season card again, as his fight against Bole was, then he might, because Anderson says he's all about the money and the Saudis pay top dollar. It's interesting. I actually read some quotes from Bob Arum, who did an interview recently. I think it was on Dan Raphael's podcast. And he basically said that he was against Jared Anderson fighting Martin Bacoli, and that it was Turki Al-Sheikh who approached Jared Anderson himself and started negotiating with the fighter, basically leapfrogging the middleman, the promoter Bob Arum. Now, Bob Arum did admit that he approved Anderson fighting on that Riyadh season card. He did have final approval. He is his promoter, but he makes out as though he didn't particularly like that fight for him. And to me, he seemed to insinuate that he didn't particularly like the way that Turki Al-Sheikh, again, leapfrogged him and went directly to the fighter. But personally, I do like it, because over the years, we've heard instances of fighters receiving offers for life-changing sums of money and not actually being told that the offer was received by either their management or their promoter, which to me is scandalous. Jared Anderson's a big boy. He can make his own decisions. He decided to fight Martin Bacoli. It backfired. Oh well, it's boxing. Stuff happens. At 24 years of age, he's young enough to come again. Anyway, I don't want to see Daniel Dubois fight Jared Anderson in his next fight. Not coming off a loss. Moving up to number 12 on the list, we've got Fabio Wardley. British fighter, orthodox, 29 years of age, 6 feet 5 inches tall, with a record of 18-0-1, 17 wins by knockout. I'm going to assume that most of you are quite familiar with Fabio Wardley, so I'm not going to spend too much time analyzing his record here. But his most recent fight was a first-round TKO victory in a rematch with Fraser Clark earlier on this month. He's athletic, he's aggressive, he's got a fighter's instincts, he's a big puncher, and due to his complete lack of amateur fights, he is somewhat unorthodox. And that can be a blessing and a curse. Now, the crucial thing here is that he's also a Frank Warren fighter. And because Frank Warren has got people like Daniel Dubois, Tyson Fury, Jel Jang, Joseph Parker, and even Moses Atauma as part of his heavyweight roster, I don't know how much belief he really has in Fabio Wardley. In other words, he might be willing to put him in against Daniel Dubois right now and possibly suffer a disastrous defeat. Not that I think Fabio Wardley's got no chance in that fight, by the way. Wardley's certainly got the mentality necessary to win the fight, without a shadow of a doubt. He's ferocious in there, and he would keep fighting and keep swinging till the bitter end. So I give him a puncher's chance against Dubois, and not a completely outside puncher's chance either, because again, this is a guy who lets his hands go. He's still in his 20s. He's still got those youthful reflexes. Although I would favor Dubois because he's got the experience, he's got the pedigree, he did have a good amateur career, he's got better fundamentals than Fabio Wardley. But yeah, I certainly wouldn't be counting Wardley out with that power, with that aggression, with that self-belief, and with the unorthodox and unpredictable nature of his boxing style. With all that being said, Wardley wouldn't be my first choice as a boxing fan for a Daniel Dubois voluntary defense, but I wouldn't necessarily hate the fight either. So, moving up to number 11 on the list, we've got Otto Wallen, a southpaw fighter from Sweden, 33 years of age, 6 foot 5 inches tall. He's got a record of 27-2, 15 wins by knockout, and one of his defeats was a corner retirement against Anthony Joshua last year. I'm not sure if Otto Wallen is still promoted by Dimitri Salita, but given the fact he's fought on a Riyadh season card before, fighting on another one is probably not out of the question. As most of you guys know, Wallen is primarily a mover over. Not the biggest puncher in the world, but he's got a good chin. He's physically durable. He famously went the 12-round distance with Tyson Fury several years ago and managed to cut Fury very badly in that fight with a nice left hand early on. He went on to beat the likes of Dominic Breazeale over 12 rounds, actually retired him. That was Dominic Breazeale's last fight. And his best win was in September last year, a 12-round split decision victory over former cruiserweight champion Murat Gassiev. Should have been unanimous, but in his next fight, of course, he was stopped by Anthony Joshua in 5 rounds. He has fought since then. In July of this year, he knocked out an obscure Nigerian opponent in 1 round. Wallen is another guy who I think will be very near the top of Daniel Dubois and Frank Warren's list of potential opponents for this voluntary defense. I think they will view him as safe. Let's just put it that way. Okay, so now we're into the top 10, and at number 10, we've got our old friend Del Boy, Derek Chisora. 40 years of age, from Zimbabwe, but based in the United Kingdom. Orthodox, 6'1", with a record of 35-13. 23 of his victories coming by knockout, and 4 of his 13 losses coming by stoppage or knockout. His most recent fight was a 10-round unanimous decision win over Joe Joyce in a really entertaining spectacle. I'm not going to go through the rest of his record because I'm sure most of you are very familiar. Chisora says that he's only going to fight 2 more times before retirement. A fight in Manchester and then a fight in his native Zimbabwe. Then he's going to call it a day. This is what he says. And I don't recall Derek Chisora ever saying that he was going to retire before. This is the first time I can recall Derek Chisora publicly stating his exit strategy, his intention to retire after a certain number of fights. He's currently had 48 bouts. He's going for 50. Nothing against Derek Chisora, but I do not want to see Daniel Dubois fight him at all. There are lots of other fresher fighters out there who I'd like to see get a crack at the heavyweight title. I don't want to see them recycling the same old names over and over again. It's not good for boxing. Derek Chisora just had a title shot in 2022 against Tyson Fury. That was a trilogy with Fury that nobody asked for. So yeah, I wouldn't want to see Dubois Chisora. It's got nothing to do with the whole Don Charles situation because Don Charles trained Chisora for years. He now trains Daniel Dubois. I don't even care about that whole story. It's just the fact that Chisora has had multiple opportunities before. I'd rather see somebody who hasn't had an opportunity before get a shot. But you know, Chisora is with Frank Warren right now, so I'm sure there are some discussions going on for a potential Dubois-Chisora fight. If it were to happen, I would certainly expect Daniel Dubois to win. Number 9 on the list, we've got Filip Hrgović, 32 years of age, from Croatia, 6'6" tall, with a record of 17-1, 14 wins by knockout, just that 1 TKO defeat in his last fight to Daniel Dubois. So there are 2 things which, for me, disqualify Filip Hrgović as an opponent for Dubois next. The fact that he's coming off a loss, and the fact that the loss was to Daniel Dubois earlier on this year. And as exciting a fight as it was, and it was an exciting fight, I could not justify a rematch happening right now. I want to see Filip Hrgović come back and get some wins under his belt first. I'm not sure what Filip Hrgovic's promotional status currently is, whether he's still with Matchroom or he's a free agent or has he gone elsewhere, I don't know. But would Frank Warren and Daniel Dubois consider Filip Hrgović as an opponent? Maybe, but I don't think he'd be very high on their list. At number 8, we've got Anthony Joshua. Well, it seems as though AJ has decided against rematching Daniel Dubois in February. I'm sure you're all completely familiar with AJ, so we don't need to go through his record or stats or anything like that. But unless we hear otherwise, we can rule him out as Dubois' next opponent based upon what we're hearing from Eddie Hearn, Frank Warren, and so on. Number 7 on the list, we've got Faajijagar, 30 years of age, from Nigeria, 6'6" tall, based in the United States. All of his pro bouts so far have been there. He's got a record of 20-1, 14 of his wins coming by knockout. The sole defeat was on points to Frank Sanchez back in 2021. His best wins were over the likes of Gino Vianello, Zan Kossobutski, Stefan Shaw, Jonathan Rice, and a very faded Amir Mansour. Jagbar is a very upright, stiff, robotic, limited fighter. He often looks very pedestrian and won't let his hands go. But the one thing he has going for him is very good punching power. This is a guy who can really crack. And when he doesn't drop or knock out his opponents, he tends to intimidate them with that power. They go into a shell. Now, Dubois doesn't have a terrible chin, but he has been down several times in his career. If Jagbar caught Dubois right, I'm sure he could make something happen. happen. And something that kind of helps Faajijagar if he were to go into a Daniel Dubois fight next is the fact that he's been fighting in competitive bouts. Not at the highest level in the world, but competitive bouts nevertheless. I mean, that kind of speaks to Ajagba's limitations, right? But it also means that he is battle hardened to some extent. So he had that tough fight with Sanchez back in 2021, came back with an easy one against a guy called Joseph Damos, but then he went in there against Stefan Shaw, and it was quite tricky. Stefan Shaw was unbeaten at the time, 18-0. Ajagba managed to overcome him. Then he beat a guy called Zan Kosobutsky, who was actually highly touted by some of my subscribers, who were adamant that he was gonna not only beat Ajagba, but destroy him. Instead, Kosobutsky panicked after he felt Ajagba's power and appeared to deliberately get himself disqualified by throwing repeated low blows, Andrew Galotta style. That fight was over in 4 rounds. Ajagba then had an easier one against a guy called Joseph Goodall before facing Gino Vianello in his last fight, which was a tough one, and that one went the distance over 10, with Ajagba getting a split decision win. So he's used to the struggle in the ring. The question is, can he stand up to Daniel Dubois' firepower? If I had to guess, I would say no. I would say that Dubois will probably be a bit too ferocious for him. Dubois has quite quick feet. He's able to bounce in and out of range and get his shots off. We saw that against AJ. So I'd certainly pick him to beat Faajijagar. How likely is it that Ajagba could be the guy that Dubois picks for his voluntary defense? Well, Ajagba is with Top Rank, and up until recently, Top Rank and Queensbury, Dubois' promoter, have had a very good relationship, but the involvement of Turki Al-Sheikh seems to be putting a little bit of a wedge between Frank Warren and Bob Arum now. They're not quite seeing as eye to eye as they were prior to the Saudi involvement in boxing. With that being said, I reckon Ajagba's fairly high up Dubois and Frank Warren's list as a potential opponent. Not as high as some, I suspect, but fairly high up. Because on paper, he's got a good record, he's a big guy, he's only had the one loss, he can punch. They can sell it, basically. Number 6 on the list, we've got Frank Sanchez. Now again, Sanchez is coming off a loss to AIC Cabael earlier on this year, so I do not want to see Daniel Dubois fight this guy. I think Sanchez is better than the Cabael performance would suggest. To me, he looked like he was injured in that fight, like he had some type of leg or knee problem, because he's primarily a mover, tends to move all around the ring in many, if not most of his fights. But against AIC Cabael, he was on the ropes for almost the whole fight. It was very, very odd. Anyway, he's a 32-year-old Cuban, orthodox, 6'4" tall, with a record of 24-1, 17 of his wins coming by knockout, with that one KO defeat to AIC Cabael, which was caused primarily by body shots. Sanchez has worn knee supports for quite a few of his fights, so I suspect there's some type of chronic injury there, a long-term problem, which caught up with him in the Cabael fight. I think at his best, he could be a serious problem for Daniel Dubois, but at his worst, as we saw against Cabael, he'd be food for Daniel Dubois, truth be told. If he's laying on the ropes like that against Triple D, he'll get taken out. But if he's able to move the way that he did when he fought Faajijagar a couple years back, yeah, I think it's a serious problem for Dubois. Not just because of his mobility and his boxing brain, but also because Sanchez actually can punch and he's explosive. But as I say, because he's coming off a loss, I wouldn't want to see Daniel Dubois fight him. But because of the nature of his loss, again, I have to imagine that he will be on Dubois and Frank Warren's shortlist. And I'm not trying to sound disrespectful of Daniel Dubois here, because he's been on a great run. Came back and beat Jarrell Miller, beat Philip Perovic, beat Anthony Joshua. So he's been very willing to take on tough opposition all the way through his career, actually. But now that he's world champion, they might start to move a little bit differently. They might start to be a little more careful with who they match him with and when. Because his next fight is likely going to be a voluntary defense, the thing that promoters tend to do in that situation is pick an easier opponent. Because after his voluntary defense, assuming he's successful, he's going to be forced to fight his mandatory, which will either be AIC Cabael or Martin Bakole, depending on who wins out of those two. And by the way, Frank Sanchez, last I checked, was a PBC fighter. Moving up to number 5 on the list, we've got the Big Bang, Jel Jang. 41-year-old southpaw fighter from China, 6 feet 6 inches tall, with a record of 27-2-1, 22 of his wins coming by knockout. His 2 defeats were on points, and he had a controversial draw with fringe contender Jerry Forrest back in 2021. Jang is a good boxer, not very fleet of foot, but he's got a good boxing brain. He's got that amateur pedigree, fought in the Olympics, actually lost to AJ in the Olympics. As a professional, he has been a late bloomer. His coming out party was the fight he had against Filip Hrgovic back in 2022. Officially, he lost that fight on a UD over 12, but many people feel that he deserved to get the decision that night. Me personally, I thought it was razor close, could have gone either way. I say that was his coming out party. That was his coming out party for me because he impressed me that night. And that was kind of the opposite of most people because they saw it as a really poor performance by Hrgovic rather than a really good performance by Jang. Whereas I saw it as a pretty good performance by both in an evenly matched fight between Hrgovic and Jang. Jang's next fight was his coming out party to the wider audience, and that was his 6-round TKO victory over Joe Joyce. He then immediately rematched Joyce and knocked him out in 3 rounds. Jang is a tremendous puncher with both hands. He then suffered a disappointing points defeat to Joe Parker via majority decision, where he gassed out something terrible in that one, but then redeemed himself in June this year, knocking out former WBC heavyweight champion Deontay Wilder in 5 rounds. Jel Jang is another Frank Warren fighter. So technically, if he put Dubois in with Jang, it's a win-win for Frank Warren because whoever wins, they're still signed to him. But there's more commercial value at this stage, you would assume anyway, in Daniel Dubois. So I would have thought that Warren wouldn't want to put Dubois in there against somebody this dangerous at this particular stage of his career. Not unless the opponent really brings something to the table by way of commercial value, more belts, etc. Jang doesn't have any belts. Now look, if the fight got made, I'd be very happy. I'd love to see Daniel Dubois versus Jel Jang. I'm just not so sure that that will happen, but I'd love to be pleasantly surprised. If it did happen, who would I pick? I think it would be a torrid fight. I would favor Dubois maybe slightly, but the southpaw angles make it more difficult for you to rush your opponent because you're having to reach further with the right hand and you're more susceptible to being countered by the backhand, the southpaw left. Jang is not gun shy or afraid like AJ is, and he's technically good. If he catches Daniel Dubois clean, Dubois is going down. But if Dubois can get out of the first half of the fight, he'll probably win it because he's got the youth, he's got the fitness, he's got the foot speed. So yeah, I'd favor Dubois slightly to maybe beat Jang on points or possibly stop him very late. But I certainly wouldn't put much money on it because Jang is very, very dangerous indeed, despite his advanced age. Now, number 4 on the list is Martin Bacoli. But as I mentioned earlier, because there are no number 1 and number 2 rated fighters at the moment with the IBF, number 3 and 4 are functionally number 1 and 2. And Bacoli has just been ordered to face the only man above him in a final eliminator, AIC Cabael. The winner will become mandatory for the IBF heavyweight title. Because of that, I doubt that either of them, Bacoli or Cabael, will be selected by Daniel Dubois or Frank Warren as a voluntary defense. I mean, technically it's possible, but I think it's improbable. If either of them were to be selected as a voluntary for Daniel Dubois, I reckon it would be Cabael. And that might be a power move by Frank Warren, come to think of it, because if Cabael was given a shot at Dubois in a voluntary defense, that would mean that Martin Bacoli would have to fight Jel Jang in a final eliminator rather than fighting Cabael. And of course, Jel Jang is another Frank Warren fighter. Bacoli, of course, is with Boxer. So Frank Warren might prefer that. Maybe get Cabael in there against Dubois to maybe protect Dubois from Bacoli and put Bacoli in there against Jang. Now, I'm not saying this is going to happen. In fact, earlier on this year, I think it was, Frank Warren ruled out Jel Jang versus Martin Bacoli, which was very disappointing to hear because I loved that fight. But knowing promoters the way that I do and the way they move, the way they operate, the scenario I've just described is a possibility. AIC Cabael has emerged as a dark horse in the heavyweight division. He's a good fighter. He's a particularly good body puncher. He's mobile when he needs to be. But I do think Daniel Dubois got the beating of him, stylistically. I think Dubois' jab, his physical strength, his aggression and his punching power might be a bit too much for Cabael. I know Cabael beat a very big, powerful man in Arslanbek Makhmudov, but Makhmudov is crude, very crude. Dubois is much faster, got much better balance, and is just a better boxer all round than Makhmudov. But hey, maybe Cabael proves me wrong once again and goes in there and smashes Dubois to pieces. If a Dubois-Cabael fight were to happen next, I'd imagine that Frank Warren would want to work out some type of deal with Cabael's promoter. I'm assuming it's a German promoter, where he'd get options on Cabael were he to beat Dubois. Obviously, there'd be a one-way rematch clause for Daniel Dubois anyway, because it's a voluntary defense, but Frank Warren might want to lock Cabael in for 1 or 2 fights beyond that. Cabael is a 32-year-old fighter of Turkish descent, but based in Germany, 6'3" tall, with a record of 25-0, 17 wins by knockout. He was European champion for a number of years after beating Derek Chisora back in the days on points, but then faded away into obscurity, fighting miscellaneous opposition before he re-emerged on that Riyadh season card last year, scored an upset victory over Arslanbek Makhmudov. He then followed it up with another impressive victory, stopping Frank Sanchez in 7 rounds. That was in May this year. Cabael appears to be a pretty good all-rounder. Got pretty quick feet, pretty quick hands, decent power there, good body puncher, gets around the ring quite well when he needs to. Haven't really seen his chin tested yet though, so there's a question mark there. Compare that to Martin Bakole, the man ranked below him, 32-year-old Congolese fighter, orthodox, 6'6", with a record of 21-1, 16 of his wins are by knockout. His sole loss was a TKO defeat to Michael Hunter back in 2018. And incidentally, if you've never seen that fight, it's a must watch. First of all, it was a really good scrap. And secondly, it revealed some interesting things about Martin Bakole because he actually tried to quit in that fight. His trainer, Billy Nelson, had to basically force him to continue. Go watch it. It's up on YouTube. You'll hear Billy Nelson pleading with Martin Bakole not to pull out of the fight. And he ended up being stopped in the final round by Michael Hunter. Got hurt, Hunter pounced on him, and the fight was waved off. Now, since then, of course, he's bounced back with, I think it's 10 wins on the trot. All but 2 of them by knockout or stoppage. His last one was a 5th round knockout victory over Jared Anderson, who was previously unbeaten. Bakole is big, he's very strong, he throws an awful lot of punches for a man his size, he's got a good jab, he's confident in the ring, he's aggressive, he's very fluid actually. He throws shots which, to the naked eye, don't look to have a lot of momentum behind them, but when they land, they have devastating effect. Of all the fighters in the top 15, I think Martin Bakole is the least likely to be picked by Daniel Dubois for a voluntary defense. I don't see him picking Bakole in a month of Sundays. Again, anything is possible, but I'd be very, very surprised. Yes, Dubois stepped in there against Jarrell Miller, Hrgovic, Joshua, but that was when he had nothing to lose. Now he's IBF champion. Let's see if he keeps that same energy. Maybe he will, but I suspect he won't. I suspect he's going to be a lot more careful about who he fights and when he fights them moving forward. And I don't think he's going to fight Martin Bakole unless and until Bakole becomes mandatory challenger. And then Dubois will be forced to fight him, either that or vacate. Now, I've heard some people complain about the fact that Joseph Parker isn't in the IBF top 15. They're saying it's a big scandal. Nah, it really isn't. The reason Joseph Parker's not in the IBF top 15 is very simple and there's no scandal behind it. It's simply the fact that Parker is WBO interim champion. And if you are any kind of champion, you will not be ranked by any of the other sanctioning bodies. That's a pretty standard rule in boxing across all the organizations. Joseph Parker has picked up a bit of a fan club in recent times because of his victories over Deontay Wilder and Jel Jang. And they were good victories, but they were also terribly boring fights. Parker is WBO interim champion, which means all he needs to do is wait for his mandatory shot to get called with the WBO. He doesn't actually need an opportunity against Daniel Dubois because he's going to get an opportunity to fight either Usyk or Fury anyway, assuming the winner of that rematch doesn't vacate the WBO belt and Parker fights the next highest ranked contender for the vacant strap. So all of this feeling sorry for Joseph Parker because he isn't getting a title shot, he's guaranteed a title shot with the WBO. It's just a matter of time. And he knew knew by becoming interim champion that he'd be dropped out of the rankings of all the other sanctioning bodies. He knew that going in, and he was willing to go that route. So it is what it is. Now, Parker, if he wanted to, could relinquish that WBO interim title, and that may allow him to be ranked in the top 15 of the IBF. I wouldn't be surprised if Frank Warren is exploring that scenario behind the scenes. Because again, Joseph Parker is another Frank Warren fighter. He's a big name, very experienced, good resume. If Daniel Dubois were to fight and beat him, it would look very good on Dubois' record. It's a very credible fight. I'm certainly not going to argue against that. Dubois Parker is very credible, but from an entertainment perspective, it definitely wouldn't be my first choice. Let's just put it that way. Parker is tough, he's wily, he's got a decent boxing brain. He's 32 years of age, orthodox, 6'4", so only slightly shorter than Daniel Dubois. He's got a record of 35-3, 23 of his wins coming by knockout, just one of his 3 defeats coming by knockout, which was to Joe Joyce. Lost to him in 11 rounds back in 2022. Parker obviously from New Zealand. I would favor Daniel Dubois against Joseph Parker. I think Dubois would be too active, too aggressive, too strong. And although Parker has the advantage in speed, at least hand speed, I don't think that would be enough to compensate for the areas in which he's weaker than Dubois. Now, I wouldn't count Joseph Parker out completely. Not saying he's got no chance, but I'd make Dubois a 65-35 favorite in my mind. How likely is it that this fight could happen? Again, they'd have to get Parker ranked by the IBF, so those discussions would have to go on behind the scenes, and that would mean Parker relinquishing his WBO interim title. I don't know whether or not he'd want to do that. I guess it depends on the money he was being offered to fight Daniel Dubois. I reckon there's a decent chance of this fight happening because Parker ticks several boxes. 1, he's a Frank Warren fighter. 2, he's a big name, so Dubois gets a lot of credit for beating him. 3, he's on a good run of form, so Dubois gets even more credit for beating him. 4, Parker's not really a puncher. Yeah, he's got some power there, but you know, he's not exactly a knockout artist. And 5, the last opponent who Parker fought that was somewhat similar to Dubois stylistically and in terms of attributes was Dillian Whyte. I'm not saying Dubois and Whyte are exactly the same. Obviously not. Dubois more athletic than Dillian Whyte, but they've got similar dimensions and they're both aggressive fighters. And Parker really wasn't able to stand up to Dillian Whyte's aggression. I know the fight went in the distance, but Dillian Whyte bullied him in there. He used his jab, he hit him in the body, he roughed him up, he stayed consistent with his work rate, and Parker did have flashes of success, but ultimately he lost. I see a Dubois fight going a similar way, and I suspect that Frank Warren and Daniel Dubois would think the same. So don't be surprised if some maneuvering goes on behind the scenes and Joe Parker ends up being the guy that Daniel Dubois faces in his next fight, a voluntary defense of his IBF heavyweight title. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Give me your thoughts in the comment section below. Who do you think Daniel Dubois is going to fight? Which one of these heavyweights in the top 15 will it be? And a separate question is, who would you like it to be? Never mind who you think it's going to be. Who would you like it to be? Personally, I'd like it to be Martin Bakole. And before I go, make sure you check out my content on Patreon. I got videos about Riddick Bowe, Tommy the Hitman Hearns, and various other fighters. And when I say videos, I'm talking about film study, where I analyze actual fight footage of their bouts, talk about the backstory behind certain fights, analyze their styles and what have you, strengths and weaknesses. Most of these boxing film studies that I've done on Patreon are at least an hour long, some of them up to 3 hours long. So loads of content over there. Make sure you check it out. The most recent one being the career review I did on Riddick Bowe, which is getting great feedback. If you want to access this video along with hundreds of hours worth of other exclusive boxing content, as well as our members chat, just head on over to my Patreon page and select the tier called the Boxing Brotherhood. There's no contract, no commitment. You can cancel at any time, just like Netflix, but it's a hell of a lot cheaper. Just download the app from the Play Store or the App Store. All the links are in the description box below.